is the day. X-Men, coming your way. Magneto's hordes are on the way to pillage, burn, and plunder. But there's one team that will not yield, the team that strikes like thunder. X-Men, this is the day, this is the day. X-Men, coming your way.
Hey there, true believers. Thanks for joining us for today's live stream about the past, present, and future of the children of the atom, Marvel's merry band of mutants, always protecting a world that hates and fears them. We're talking about the X-Men. Joining me today is Bill Scurry, who put together that intro with that incredible song from 1989, I believe was that pilot. But we have so much to get into with this, and we're not going to try to squeeze in 60 years of X-Men comics and games and animation and live action movies into this one live stream. But if people like this could end up being the first of a series of conversations on this topic. But let me just dive right in with my first question to Bill. And I've got a couple other questions from the community tab, which we'll be getting to shortly. But here's my question. The X-Men have been around since September 1963. And in that time, we've seen the publication of countless comics, along with animated adaptations, video games, and of course, the live action movies. There have been 13 movies since the summer of 2000. But back in 2019, Disney bought Fox, along with the rights to the X-Men library. So now their first flick, Deadpool 3, is in the works, and a lot of classic characters are expected to reappear. And in theory, it's coming out next summer, pending results from the SAG strike. But first question. What ingredients from Deadpool 3 have grabbed your interest, and can the R-rated flavor of Deadpool survive in Disney's current corporate culture?
Well, the first thing I think of in terms of that rated R thing is that, Deadpool 2 legged out to about 790, I think, right? Almost got to 800 million. It was...
As well as the first.
Yeah, right. So those movies are to date the most successful financially of all these Fox X-Men movies. And it did so with an R rating. Now, you could say that that's incredible. Like, that doesn't happen every single day. But I think if you're going to get to the C-suite up in Burbank, when Disney is looking at this saying, well, a rated R movie got out to 800, it's like, Jesus, what if it was PG-13? Could we go over 1 billion? And I think that's shitty thinking as far as I'm concerned, because
just follow it to the logical conclusion. Let's make it G and just go to 3.
Well, it's like they will probably lose the lessons that they learned with Tim Miller's Deadpool 1. And look, I think Deadpool 2, I'm in the minority here. I did not like it. I think that Ryan Reynolds took the wrong lessons away from his own movie, that he worked really hard to get Deadpool 1 made. It was a labor of love. It was super, super low budget. What was it, 60 million maybe?
Yep. First one was 60. The second one was like 115, but they performed roughly the same. So the additional budget did not change performance.
Yeah, and I thought that the losing Tim Miller and instead bringing in Leach, who went on to direct Bullet Train, he just did that, action auteur guy. I didn't like the decisions that Ryan Reynolds was making. I feel like he somehow was starting to mismanage his own property. So the thing is, the third one is being helmed by Sean Levy. It's another example of Ryan Reynolds bringing in one of these kind of I was going to call him a hack. I don't think Sean Levy's a great director, but he's friends. They're cronies together because
he'll do as he's told.
Well, he will, and he's made a lot of money, and he's been very successful. He did all the Night at the Museum movies, and he's a proven craftsman. He's not an artist. I don't think he's like a yeoman director, and that's fine. The question is the synthesis of all this stuff together: the rated R thing, Disney looking at it, new director, and then what is Ryan Reynolds' profile with Deadpool now, and of course the two strikes. Killing it. It's weird. I feel like I'm going to be there regardless to see it, but it really defies a prediction just because there's so much dust in the air right now.
We'll be there to see it, but we'll be there multiple times. Deadpool 1, I saw multiple times in the theater. I watched it again last night. Still holds up insanely well, but I agree with you. A lot of the lessons from the first movie seem to be ignored in the second, where I love, the inappropriate comments and all the silliness and whatnot, but it was balanced in the first one with some moments of real darkness where you really got to see like that is a dark character who's capable of real violence. And he occasionally gets really pissed and shows some rage. I feel like the second movie only went in on the silly side exclusively. They also screwed up the Juggernaut. So yeah, the franchise has screwed up the Juggernaut on 2 occasions now, but there were details that I loved in the second. Domino was fucking fantastic. The death of X-Force on their first mission was fucking hilarious. Like there was a lot that really worked in the second one, but I think the first one is vastly superior. But at this point, seeing what's happening with Secret Invasion, seeing what happened with Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, seeing what's happened with so many Marvel properties as of late, my confidence in Disney's ability to deliver a really satisfying Deadpool 3 experience is low, but who knows? Maybe I'll be happily surprised. Ryan Reynolds might put on his producer hat and really make it deliver. And if they bring back Storm and they bring back Jean and they bring back Scott, like maybe that'll be cool. But then again, maybe it's just going to be a silly little scene where you see them like in a room of the mansion. So I don't know what to expect, but I'm keeping my expectations modest.
Yeah, I think that Ron Reynolds at this moment is a little high in his own supply. He's got this, he's running this football club in England. He's kind of got this reputation now as like the internet's, goofy older brother or cousin. The role he occupies is a really sort of friendly, amiable guy where you have a lot of access to him via his Twitter account. And, to be honest, other than he made that, the Atom Project or something like that, he doesn't really have a whole lot of other high-profile movies. I guess
Free Guy, he got paid like $50 million for. So yeah, he did very well financially from that, irrespective of what people think of the flick.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, and Free Guy was very well received as well. I mean, I did. It's not for me. I'm sure it's fine. It's not for me. So yeah, it's a weird thing. I mean, again, Ryan Reynolds is that guy. He hung on for so long, one flop after another, reconfiguring himself. He did the Amityville Horror, so he thought, oh, we'd be the horror guy. And they did Green Lantern.
He survived Wolverine Origins. He survived Green Lantern. He's been to the trenches and back.
Yeah. No, he's like Darwin, the X-Men character. You can't kill the fucking guy because he just adapts to whatever imbroglio he's in.
All right, well, let me switch over to one quick question from the community tab. I posted a question or a spot earlier yesterday, and a lot of people actually responded. So I want to make sure that I get to those questions before we get to mine. So the first one would be from K Young 3187. I love the X-Men, but haven't kept up with the last couple of movies. If they totally reboot, I would love to see a more adult and confident Rogue. I did like Anna Paquin, but she was not the Rogue I loved as a kid. Also, I love Evan Peters as Quicksilver. He stole many scenes as a semi-minor mutant, in my opinion. Also, Hugh Jackman is Wolverine. I don't know who could play it as well as he has. You and I were just talking about this before we started recording. So, I mean, I guess before we get to those details, do you even want to see Disney attempt to capture all these stories, or should they just wrap things up with the existing Fox characters and then just kind of let it slide into oblivion? Or would you like to see them take a crack at doing Rogue and trying to get it right? Because there's so much about her story, from being a villain to stealing Carol Danvers' powers, to her redemption arc in the X-Men, to basically becoming like the lover of Gambit, even though they can't touch in the 90s, and basically becoming like the world's most sassy Dolly Parton, badass and vulnerable flying strong girl. Like, is it even possible for the movies to capture all that?
No, but it could at least try for a green costume. I mean, I just feel that there are certain 101 things with Rogue that would have made the character stand out so much more. And when Singer made X1 in 2000, it was truly a movie that was ashamed of being a comic book movie. And Singer, I'm sure he read comics growing up, but he wasn't interested in doing a comic book looking movie. We just didn't have the visibility, the technology, the inclination wasn't there. And so, I mean, a number of things suffered in the first X-Men movie, and Rogue principally among them, because, Anna Paquin's a great actor, but Anna Paquin didn't give there was no rogue-ishness to her. And she's such a strong, distinctive character. And I would even say that she's one of Chris Claremont's, favorite characters. She stuck around. And, we were just talking again, like you said before we went live, is that he loves Rogue, and he lovingly detailed and described Rogue in so many different states along the way. It's like there's nearly 50 or 60 issues, which are kind of like Rogue's, that she's describing the arc, all the things that she goes through. He doesn't miss. He doesn't fuck up anything about Rogue. It's really wonderful. And it should be the kind of thing that you want to indulge in. I mean, just because she's supposed to have a Cajun accent, just because she can't touch anybody, she should have a large white streak through her hair. She should have some form of green. That's her iconography. If you're going to give Wolverine the sort of actual iconography that they plant on Hugh Jackman, you could do the same thing for whoever it is when you bring in with Rogue. And Anna Paquin, it's not her fault, but she didn't get there.
Yeah. Totally agree. All right, well, let's get back to one of my questions. Of the 13 live-action X-Men movies, I'd say I'm an unapologetic fan of 6 of them. I like X-Men, X2 quite a lot, X-Men First Class, X-Men Days of Future Past, Deadpool, and Logan. And I've got a soft spot for some scenes in Deadpool too, but how highly do you rate this film series overall? And which films do you think are going to age the best? When we look back on the great 20-year heyday, like the golden age of the superhero movie, which of these movies are going to endure?
It's a strange franchise because it pitted out in the center. I mean, it pivoted and it nearly blew up, and it kind of gained its footing again and made some incredible financial moves after that. It looked like it was about to completely work itself into oblivion, and then you get the two Singer, well, at least the one First Class, and then the Singer movie, Future Past, which sort of save it. Didn't see that coming. But the two movies I think are the standout are easily X2 and Logan. You know, I mean, I think those were the ones that will age the best of them. X2 was sort of in that same family of Spider-Man 2 with Alfred Molina, where, you know, whatever the throat clearing was, whatever getting the sort of technique right with the first movies, the second one was like the kind of like the sharpened pencil of the set. It did a much better job, and it was more, you don't have to build the world, I guess, by the time you get around there. But Logan was so much better than the Wolverine because Mangold, again, maybe he felt like, I don't need to build the world. I could just sort of tell a James Mangold story that refers heavily back to that Mark Miller Old Man Logan story, but still said something fresh. And, you know, it was much
because
more...
Old Man Logan was like an alternate future where we got to see like Hawkeye old, et cetera, and so forth. Like it had like all the baggage and history of many, many decades of Marvel history. Like, whereas the movie, it's just like, no, let's just tell a story about Logan as he's old.
Yeah, I mean, but it's just, I read Mangold in that movie. It's like he found what he loved about Hugh Jackman and Patrick Stewart. He inserted the things, and he found that kid actor, that Spaniard little girl who played Laura.
Incredible X-23. She was fabulous.
Yeah, that stuff is, you know, that's why, I mean,
and they nailed that aspect of Wolverine where between Kitty, Jubilee, and a couple other characters where he would play the role of mentor to like young teenage girls coming into the X-Men that were like, oh my God, like this is so crazy. This is so scary. And he would take them under their wing and like basically teach them how to be a ninja. I mean, it was really fucking cool. And he did it over and over and over again. And some of those best Jim Lee issues are when we see Jubilee and Psylocke and Wolverine off as like their own little trio having their own adventures. So I thought the movie Logan nailed that aspect of Wolverine's character perfectly.
Yeah, just, you know, some more love for X2 really quickly. I think that bringing in, I mean, I know that the character of Stryker was a little bit of a confabulation of a few things. However, it still worked, and bringing in Brian Cox to play the role was a masterstroke because, again, that makes 3 gigantic tentpoles. You get Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, and Brian Cox, like some of the best actors in the English-speaking world, adding all that gravitas. That was a brilliant change, and again, it like Singer managed to figure out what made these things click. I mean, some of the characters still got left behind. They didn't know what to do with Colossus.
Sabretooth sadly got disposed of.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was cool seeing Mystique and Magneto teaming up at the X-Men. I feel like that was one of the best team ups possible. Where they're only 2 movies deep, and they're already showing like these unholy alliances between the mutants that have different philosophies and different politics and that sort of thing.
And the sequence where Mystique injects the prison guard with like a liquid metal, and then Magneto rips it out of his bloodstream and makes it's awesome. That's a great sequence.
It was so fucking good. Yeah, no, Ian McKellen and Rebecca Romaine, they were pitch perfect casting all the way. So getting back to some of the questions from Twitter, from Everything is Awesome. Every TH 25550903. People need to work on their handles. So anyway, he writes, how would you approach this franchise now? If rebooting, would it start from an origin story like X-Men First Class, or is there a story arc that hasn't been brought to screens yet? Like if I were omnipotent and could just move the levers of society, I would force Disney to at least sell off all the X-Men characters and just to keep their hands off of them, because I have a zero confidence attitude when it comes to Disney and superheroes these days. And I would prefer just to see like a kick-ass like an animation studio, maybe like even a Japanese animation studio doing everything. Like if you could get like the Warren Ellis Castlevania treatment of like 4 seasons set in the world of X-Men, that's where I would like to go. And as Bill and I are going to be getting to in the latter part of this recording, we have so many story arcs, basically from like the early 60s, probably up through like the 2000 teens, like from Stan Lee to Jonathan Hickman. There are so many incredible story arcs along the way to get to. Like, I would love to see an adult graphic version of the Morlocks and what they're really like, and the subsequent mutant massacre at the hands of the Marauders and who work for Mr. Sinister, and then seeing the X-Men getting revenge against the Marauders. Like, see that done well, where you see Colossus getting crippled and Kitty Pryde getting crippled and like Nightcrawler being thrown into a coma. Like, that is some dark shit that you would never see in a normal Disney product. But I'd kill to see Claremont storylines with the Brood and the Starjammers out in space. But if you wanted to go a little more modern, like hire Grant Morrison to produce a TV show based on his entire new X-Men run, like that's what I would do. I will see anything and everything Disney puts out that involves the X-Men characters, but I'm just my new healthy attitude towards Disney is keep all your expectations at rock bottom, and then you can't get your feelings hurt.
Yeah, it's too bad because Disney / Marvel, I mean, the successes that Marvel Studios had before Disney came in and decided to wring the stone dry of all the blood you could possibly pull out of it. It's a real goddamn shame, because it's possible that a man like James Gunn is out there, somebody for whom the material would have worked really well. Now, I mean, I look upon this retroactively, where I really like the 3 Guardians of the Galaxy movies. I really like the Suicide Squad as well. I think that in retrospect, the material that he would have vibed with even better would have been the X-Men. We just didn't have that opportunity. It's gone now. But I know that what it means is there are these people out there there's like a dream marriage of these filmmakers to the material, much like Logan with Mangold and Guardians of the Galaxy with James Gunn. There's somebody out there.
Gunn could have handled Punk Rock Storm from the 80s, that transition.
No shit. Yeah. So I think that we just have to find who they are and allow them, because again, there are successes in the modern, the shitty run of Disney movies. There are good turns at these characters, and it's possible that we can get more of them. I think that, like you said, we have a nearly inexhaustible supply of stories going back for 60 years. And I can guarantee you that some of whatever they do with the mutants there's going to be a handful of shitty movies, but I think that we're just going to have to hang on for the 2 or 3 that wind up being real successes. And if that's the strike rate, I'm happy. I'm going to live with that, because they all can't be great.
I can live with this. I can say, you know what? 60 years is a pretty good run for any fictional setting, and we've got hundreds, if not thousands, of great comics. We have got some great episodes of animation. Like last night and this morning, I revisited the 9 episodes of season 3 of the animated series, dealing with first just the Phoenix Saga and the Imcron Crystal, and then there was like a couple episode filler in between, and then they did 4 episodes devoted to the Dark Phoenix Saga. I was like, you know what? Every single frame of these is 1,000 times better than anything Simon Kinberg attempted with X3 with the X-Men Dark Phoenix movie. And I just couldn't believe, like, even little things like when Phoenix finally raises hell, she's gone from Black Queen to Dark Phoenix as she's leaving what they call the Circle Club, because it's an animated show for kids, but it's the Hellfire Club. But they included the panels where they cut away to Doctor Strange, Thor, and the Watcher reacting in horror to the transformation. Like, that's interesting. It comes straight from the John Byrne, Chris Claremont run, but those characters haven't been established in the cartoon at all, but they threw them in there just for comic book accuracy. It's like, wow, like this show is really trying to do the most loving adaptation humanly possible. So I feel like, yeah, between the games and the animation and the movies, the X-Men have had a great run. And my attitude is, between Deadpool 3 and Secret Wars, everybody's already been cast in the past. Let them have a few more moments in the sun and then call it a day. That is my grim kind of outlook.
I think you have to shuffle out the Fox epoch entirely. I mean, I guess they're going to keep Deadpool running for a while, but what I think I would like to see more than anything is Medius Race start to the X-Men, where it's like, the way that Alex Ross drew them in Marvels, where they're already out there. Yeah, but it's like they're clearly already a team. They already got the blue outfits on. They're skulking in the shadows.
Iceman gets hit by that block and he's about to raise hell, and Cyclops like, no, Iceman, it isn't worth it. It's like such a great dramatic beat.
Yeah, but I mean, rather than try to world build, because again, we had X-Men First Class. We had a couple of movies where we already established what we know of Xavier. We don't need to retell that story anymore. It's already been told to death. What we need to do is see the X-Men behaving as we know them to their full potential. Which I'm sorry, it means no Cyclops, no James Marsden Cyclops, no Famke Janssen, Jean Grey. Like, they need to get the cat. Even Ty Sheridan, the kid who played him in the last set of Singer movies? It's like they got Cyclops wrong, so wrong, where it's like they just found these flaxen, uncharismatic actors. No disrespect intended to Marsden. He's turned into a good actor. But there was nothing just, those characters need to be important. They need to hold this thing up. And they just didn't cast them correctly. And they didn't get them. They just didn't fucking get them.
Yeah, and they didn't write them correctly. It all boils down to the writing. And with the movies early on, I mean, people need to remember that in the early 90s, Wolverine was the most popular character on the planet Earth, like next to like Freddy Krueger. Like he was like this guy. You would walk by a comic shop and you'd either see the John Romita Jr. poster of him slashing vertically downward, or you'd see the Arthur Adams poster of him kind of hunched over, lunging toward you. But you saw those images over and over and over again. So I get that with the movies, they realized, you know what, we need to put Wolverine front and center, which is why you get X-Men Origins Wolverine, which is why you get the Wolverine, which is why you get Logan. Obviously, we all love and adore Wolverine. And I read in real time the issues where Chris Claremont and Frank Miller changed the character forever, where he went from just being kind of a tough guy bruiser to being like a wandering Ronin and trying to reclaim his honor and his humanity. And that's where the character really started to take on new dimensions in the 80s, where he was still a killer, but he wasn't a murderer, and he had a code, and it was fascinating to watch that character evolve. So at least that character got his day in the sun. But I feel like the X-Men lineup has like 50 characters that all deserve a similar level of love and adoration and like proper treatment. I mean, the list goes on and on. Honestly, no other form of media other than comics could probably ever do it justice, unless you just had a really long, ongoing animated series, in my opinion. But another question from the community tab, from @JoeRiggin. Sweet, the X-Men are the best. I have a few questions. I'll read them out first, and then I'll get to our answers. What's your favorite story arc out of the Claremont run that you feel hasn't gotten the attention it deserves? Where do you land on the toss-up of X-Men or Doom Patrol first? Is X-Men or Teen Titans the better coming-of-age young adult dramedy? I don't really care about my questions getting exposure. I'm pretty sure I can listen to you talk about the Children of the Atom for hours. That is the goal, because Bill and I will are going to have plenty of material left over when this thing wraps up. Bill, go first. What's your favorite story arc out of the Claremont run that hasn't gotten the attention it deserves, either amongst comic book fans or by the movies?
Yeah, I looked at this question beforehand because I had to think there's so much of the Claremont run. I mean, from end to end, it's nearly all been exploited and developed and talked to death. But it's like there are those sort of inter-series between gigantic epochal stories that kind of get forgotten about. They're either not included in trade paperback reprints, or they involve some substitute artists as you get one team to go into the next arc and things like that. But I just read recently, I read Barry Windsor Smith's Life Death. It was 2 parts, 1 and 2.
So good.
Yeah, 186 and 198, and that's kind of like one thread across two. I mean, there's like almost like 10 issues between them. But
it's like, but for pretentious theater kids who wanted real meaty drama in their superhero comics when we were aged like 9 or 10, that filled that role.
And that pays off in Fall of the Mutants too. Like, again, Claremont was known for just keeping these threads dangling since forever. However, that actually paid off with the Fall of the Mutants when she gets her powers back. It involves Storm essentially getting zapped with a neutralizer ray. I would also say, and this is me going back to when I started reading the X-Men in real time, was the Silvestri into Lee period. I guess it was, I followed Jim Lee off of Punisher War Journal onto the X-Men. It was so exciting knowing that he was going to come on. That was the beginning of the 90s, essentially. The Image generation was born there. And so
Jim Lee's first issue of X-Men was 248 in 1989. But then where he really started to make a name for himself was 256 to 258, where you had Psylocke becoming Lady Mandarin, which was glorious.
Yeah, and so there's X-Men 268 was a pretty, it's an issue that they still hold up today, which is Captain America, Black Widow, and Wolverine set during World War II.
Iconic.
It's iconic. It established a lot of that stuff that had just been teased about. It's like, no, they were in the service together. They were all spies. And then 270 and 272, Extinction Agenda. That was all of the. There was such a wandering through the wilderness of introducing Gambit, Storm being a little baby, Jubilee coming into her own, and then the team was in pieces. Colossus had his mind wiped. He was called Peter Nicholas at that point. He was just like an artist somewhere. And
Claremont loved destroying the team, then reassembling it, and destroying the team and because he destroyed the team of the Mutant Massacre and then reassembled it for the Silvestri era. and then he destroyed them again and brought them all back together for the arrival of X-Men #1, which was the highest selling comic ever. So I think 7 million or 8 million copies.
Yeah, and then Jim Lee, I know because at that point, I know he must have said to Chris Claremont what he wanted to draw. And just before he got out the door, before they did the X-Men, adjectiveless X-Men, from 273 to 278, he did the X-Men out in space. And so it was obviously the comics that Jim Lee grew up reading were the X-Men and the Shi'ar Empire.
Yeah.
And so he got to draw a Gladiator and Smasher and all the various Imperial Guard. And that was just ecstasy to see Jim Lee go to town on those people.
Yeah, speaking of the Imperial Guard, as I was watching the X-Men animated series last night and today, when I saw that every single member was done comic book accurate, like they didn't need to. No one would make them. No one's holding their feet to the fire. They chose to. They wanted to. And I feel like that's the attitude that oftentimes I get so frustrated with comic book movies and adaptations, where they don't seem to understand why it's useful to make Smasher look like kind of like a Wonder Man wannabe, kind of like knockoff. But you want to see the Imperial Guard exactly the way they're supposed to be. You don't want to see Gladiator reimagined. I want the Mohawk. I want the purple skin. I want to see him moving planets around. I want to see Gladiator in all of his weird late 70s, early 80s glory. And yeah, so the animated series is funny how like the first season starts out so innocent. You can tell this is a show. It says at the beginning, like for ages 7 and up. You're like, all right, I'm going to get a seminal story for ages 7 and up. But by season 3, you can tell they're trying to almost kind of sneak in like little saboteurs or smugglers, slightly more adult, mature storytelling. So that was cool to see evolve. But getting back to the questions we were just asked, when it comes to X-Men or Doom Patrol, there's no debate. Doom Patrol came first in June of 1963. So whether or not Stan Lee read it, who knows? But obviously, comic books have been ripping off each other forever. Captain Marvel, the original, the Shazam Captain Marvel, was a ripoff of Superman. And obviously you've got like Submariner and Aquaman and like, you know, the Flash and Quicksilver. And it's like, anyway, everybody's always stealing from everybody. If Stan Lee wanted to provide a loving homage to Doom Patrol, like, you know, I wouldn't put it past him. But as far as X-Men or Teen Titans go, what I love is how we don't have to choose, because Walt Simonson drew the ultimate company crossover between Marvel and DC. We had the Teen Titans and the X-Men fighting Darkseid and Dark Phoenix, which might have been the first time I'd seen a comic with either of those villains when I was like 7 when that came out. Drawn beautifully. It drew the source wall, or gave us the source wall for the first time, like in all of its glory. One of the coolest comics of that period.
Was it called Apocalypse Now, right?
One called Apocalypse Now. The official title, hang on, I've got it written down under my Walt Simonson area. It is called Uncanny X-Men and the New Teen Titans, and it's from 1982.
Okay. Yeah, it's gorgeous. If anybody hasn't seen it, I don't know if it gets reprinted that often just because of the enmity between the two companies.
It's like illegal. You basically have to buy an original version.
Yeah, right. You could do that, or I hate to say that you can go online and can pirate it. But if they're not fucking putting this stuff out, then Jesus, I can't fault you for finding it some extra legal ways, for God's sake.
Yeah, that should be more readily available. But anyway, I've still got my original copy from when I was 6 because I'm a mean old man and I hung on to all my comics. So,
hey, you know, some of those amalgam comics from the mid 90s aren't so, was that 80 and 96, 97? Those are actually pretty good. Some of them were like inspired. There was the amalgam comics. It was Marvel versus DC where Captain America fight Batman, and it was like down to a standstill. That was a George Perez drawn crossover. That stuff was also really solid.
Yeah. Well, just to get to the end of his question, when he came to which is the better young adult drama, while I love the Marv Wolfman, George Perez era of New Teen Titans, I was an X-Men junkie. I started getting a subscription around 145 with that issue with Dr. Doom on the cover holding Storm, and he's like raising a chalice. And I was basically a monthly subscriber from that point on. My first issue I ever owned was 143. So the adventures of Kitty Pryde and the adventures of the New Mutants throughout the 80s mirrored and reflected my own childhood. So throughout my childhood years, I mean, I was learning to read through X-Men comics. Like even when like the X-Men showed up in the pages of Rom's Space Knight because they thought they were looking for a mutant, but it turned out to be a member of the Dire Wraiths and that sort of thing. I can remember looking at the word balloons and just thinking they looked like hieroglyphics. I couldn't read them, but I had my dad read it out for me. So I watched I watched the New Mutants grow up. I watched Illyana Rasputin grow up. And so it was the perfect harmony of like the age where I was and the stories I was reading. But what about you?
Yeah. anything I've had to do with Wolfman, I appreciate Wolfman's style, but I thought that the character of Wolfman's language was so much akin to the older generation. He seemed to still be writing in the Roy Thomas mode, whereas Chris Claremont was, all in on dragging the language of comics. I'm talking about the actual character of the language. In addition to the storybook soap opera character of the narrative itself, which was also, I mean, again, we could just keep on talking about Chris Claremont. We probably will.
It's 16 years of greatness. It's a lot.
It's amazing. Yeah, but so it's like the X-Men, I think, have an advantage over, because Chris Claremont, the type of writing he does was so modern, was so cutting edge, it was so fresh, it was so ahead of its time, and I feel like all credit given to Marv Wolfman, but I think Marv Wolfman, it still sounded like the language sounded like I was like H.R. Puff and stuff, like Sid and Marty Krofft type TV writing. It was just, in some cases, it was silly, not all around, but I don't know. It just felt. I
read Teen Titans for the George Perez art, but I read the X-Men for the Chris Claremont. Like those intros when he gives like the brief description of every character in case you're a new reader and things like that. Anyway, every time I had a few friends that liked comics in the mid 80s and late 80s, and every new issue we would like gather around it like we had found like the Lost Ark. It was an event. These little 75-cent issues of paper and print and that sort of thing. And it blows my mind just how much of just how emotionally invested I was in this ongoing saga. And once again, I can't emphasize it enough, the dividends that would be paid off, where he would tease something and then sometimes years later you'd finally get those payoffs where like you get a frame. Like I remember when there's an issue where Polaris and Havoc are driving along and they're not part of the X-Men at this point, and a car careens around the corner and they go tumbling down the side and Havoc has to shoot a boulder. And then it goes away, and at the very end they see that one of those brood sharks has landed. Like, oh my God, like the human race is doomed. And then it takes like 15 issues. And then you finally get the payoff where you get this 3-issue arc where there's a brood queen that's infecting mutants. And it's like the patience it would take, or maybe he was just absent-minded professor and would get distracted from juggling so many storylines. But those payoffs that when they would finally come, like, oh yeah. Anyway, it was just a constant thrill ride throughout my entire childhood.
And I mean, in going through, again, I must have read about a 16-inch high stack of books over the last week just cramming for this. And to see something that Claremont did, I know that people talk about comic books today as the illusion of change. It's the idea that everything goes
second act storytelling. Yeah, permanent second act storytelling.
Permanent second act storytelling. The thing is, what you do is you leave everything in the way you found it for the next guy who comes in. And it's like Claremont had the ability of like 16 years. He did not leave things the way he found them. And it's so strange that power sets, personalities, things could just go away for like year-long stretches. All of a sudden, Rogue has been redefined in terms of what she can do. And Aurora Monroe, not only is she wearing a different costume and has a different job with the X-Men, but she's powerless for years.
Yeah, leading the X-Men with no powers. That was badass. But she had fucking knives in her fists. And I love it during Mutant Massacre. Somebody tries to take her power. She's like, pity, I don't have any. And just punches him in the stomach and doubles him over. I was like, yes.
The fight for supremacy with Callisto. And I mean, Paul Smith draws the shit out of that sequence. I posted some on social media this week. It's like how Paul Smith.
I thought that was the one Walt Simonson issue where they have the knife fight, because Walt Simonson does one stand-in issue, which
that wasn't him. That was a Smith issue.
Because Paul Smith, he has a little break. He goes from 165 to 170, and then 172 to 175, and then it was
Ramita Slink's in there too for a couple of
and
days.
Then Walt Simonson popped in for 171. So anyway, so Walt Simonson, you know what, you're right. Paul Smith is during the knife duel. It's the next issue where you see Storm on the first page saying like, the Morlocks, I'm now your leader. That was Walt Simonson's splash page.
Yeah. That was it. Yeah. Again, it's such incredible stuff. Stirring.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So while we're on the topic, we'll get to my last question. You've been just pouring over the pages for the last few weeks. If you were to go to a desert island and you could only take 5 arcs with you, and I say an arc, I mean an arc that is uninterrupted, where the creative team remains the same, like no having another, no Barry Windsor Smith popping in for an issue. If you had to pick 5 uninterrupted arcs with the writer and the artist being consistent throughout, which arcs are you taking? And if you can, specify the issues for people who may have not read them.
Yeah, I hope you're going to answer this question too, because I know you have some good ones, and I bet you there's some overlap here. So
I don't have my issues written down, but my artists are John Byrne, Dave Cockrum, Paul Smith, John Romita Jr., Mark Silvestri. The arcs, whatever is the longest arc that's uninterrupted for any of those 5 artists, that's what I'm taking.
That's funny. I'm not a Cockrum guy. I give him all the credit in the world, but I never fell in love with Cockrum's art the way I did Byrne, and it's just
Giant Size X-Men #1. Even it was Len Wein who wrote that, but Giant Size X-Men #1 is just it's the old X-Men and the new X-Men fighting Krakoa. It's just glorious.
Yeah, so I'll go in chronological order, starting in 1980. Everyone already knows this, but Dark Phoenix is just insane. It's elemental storytelling, cracking the crust of the earth. X-Men 129 to 138. That's Byrne, Claremont, and Terry Austin.
If you want to be totally psycho, and this is breaking my own rules, but it's actually the end of issue 100 where she first meets the Phoenix Force, and you get that classic Scott with like the exclamation mark.
Yeah. And
it's basically, if you want to get the full story, you got to go from 100 to 137. Because it's dipping in and out and it's teasing. And that's why the movies will never get it right. Because they told that story over years and years and years before you finally paid off.
Yeah, no, that is true. But of course, these are the things you can actually go out and find on Amazon or Kindle or something right now. If you want to actually go out and read these things in a bite-sized form, these are the ways you're going to do it.
But the issues that Bill's talking about, I have my collection here with a cover by Bill Sienkiewicz, and I've probably read this trade paperback more than any other in my library. Pages are all turning brown, they're stiff and withered, but I read this over and over and over again.
It's a holy text. I mean, it's the Bhagavad Gita of comics. There's no shit. All right, so the second one I'm going to throw out, we both love this one, Asgardian Wars, which is 2 different. I'm going to cheat on this one because it's actually 3 different series. It's X-Men Alpha Flight 1 and 2, which is Claremont, drawn by Paul Smith, inked by Wycheck. It is New Mutants Special Edition, Claremont again, Arthur Adams on art, and it is X-Men Annual 9. Again, Claremont and Art Adams. And it is 2 halves of the same story, absolutely stunning art. It is the 80s on full rip. And
it's my favorite issue of the New Mutants that I've ever read.
Yeah. Oh, and there's no doubt. I mean, I had them as actual floppies back in the day because I bought them as back issues. And I mean, I will guarantee you that there's only a couple of people in the 80s who could pencil. Mike Zeck was one of them. Mike Zeck was a fucking master. Arthur Adams, though, the amount of detail he put into his frames. I mean, he did full backgrounds. He did chain mail, fabric, plate armor. I mean, you're talking about an epochal shift in the way, dragging comic book penciling into a different kind of modernity. Neil Adams may have bracketed the 60s to the 70s, but Arthur Adams had a different level of detail altogether. And so, I mean, for that to begin with the Paul Smith pencils, which are just classically beautiful, and then go into the two extended issues of Art Adams pencils.
And as is always the case, the status quo is not restored. Like Danny Moonstar, she's forever changed. She becomes a fucking Valkyrie.
She becomes a Valkyrie.
Yeah.
I love that.
I love seeing the characters changing and evolving because she has her mirage powers and she uses it once to conjure Hela to scare some people off. But the character is always changing and growing, whether you're talking about Ilyana or Jean Grey or whomever. Nothing's ever set in stone.
Okay, so now here I'm going to leapfrog over the entire 1990s. We're going to pick up with E for Extinction, New X-Men 114 to 116. It's hard to ignore this one. This was, again, another...
The first 3 by Frank Quitely with his pencils.
Yes, exactly. And that's the thing. Frank Quitely came on and he could not keep it up. And I think it was Igor Kordy, I think it was, or Igor Kordy, I think, was like a Croatian penciler who came in and he had to work on such punishment. The artwork on the entire Grant Morrison story from end to end is not equal to there's some great Phil Jimenez stuff, some Quitely stuff.
It's ups and downs, but every once in a while, Quitely will show up with a couple issues.
Yeah, and so E for Extinction, it's 2 or 3 issues. It's incredible. Again, that was a paradigm shift, and that was Joe Quesada flailing, Marvel at the end of bankruptcy, gambling on getting these Vertigo guys to come in, and it's like that was a bellwether for the kind of things that were going on across.
It's one of the arcs that brought me back to comics because in the late 90s, Marvel had gotten so bad, and I was getting so into movies, I bailed on reading comics entirely, apart from a few things like The Authority or Planetary and things like that. But when Grant Morrison started writing the X-Men, I was like, oh, I might start buying Marvel comics again, and it sucked me back in.
It was Axel Alonso, was a DC guy. He brought those Vertigo guys with him to Marvel, and no one was sort of watching what they were doing, and they got a chance to reinvigorate the company. I mean, it evened out after a little while. Okay, moving on next. we're going to go with the story called Gifted. Astonishing X-Men 1 through 6, the first arc of Whedon and Cassaday, 2004. It is incredible.
Which resurrected Colossus in maybe the most romantic panel in the history of comics, when Kitty puts her hand to her chest and he runs through her and she's still stunned in the same position as he goes off to beat the fuck out of people. First rate.
Yeah, and like Joss Whedon wanted,
and they finally bone after years of virginal bliss and sexual tension. They come downstairs and Wolverine smells them. It's like, about time. I was like, that is so gross but so cute. Like, we're smelling the sex on them.
And that's the thing, is that Joss Whedon did uncredited punch up on X-Men 1 in 2000.
Oh, you want me to run the clip?
Yeah, run that clip if you can.
Hey, it's me.
Prove it.
You're a dick.
Okay.
Yeah, that's pure Joss Whedon for you. And so he actually got a chance. Marvel said, why don't you just sort of run this title? You can do whatever you want. You're outside of continuity, essentially. And what Joss Whedon wanted to do was replay a lot of great Claremont beats. And so this is as loving an homage to Claremont as there can be. The story is great. John Cassidy's pencils are just as solid as they were on Planetary. It is a solid book. I mean, and beyond Gifted, there was Gifted, Dangerous, and I forget the third one.
Yeah, it was 24 issues plus an annual, but it was a great run. The issues started coming slower and slower toward the end because he's getting busy with like shows and movies. But now you can just read it in its entirety. But I can remember being frustrated at the time that it was taking so long for the latter issues to come out.
Yeah, and that was the problem with Planetary. It took like the last 3 issues of Planetary took something like 7 years to draw. Like Cassidy just has a strange work pattern. Okay, and the last one I'm going to put out, much more recent, 2019. I loved Dawn of X, House of X and Powers of 10. That was Hickman.
It's basically a 2 6-issue limited series kind of interwoven together.
It was so good. I mean, I know that the X-Men were acting out of character and people just were turned off by it. And I mean, I think the fandom mostly calls it Fuck Island because it just wound up being this really weird recontextualization of the X-Men. This huge polyamorous fuck cult on Krakoa. But I think that Hickman, you know what? Like Nightcrawler did not act like Nightcrawler, and Charles Xavier did not act like Charles Xavier. But it's like, fuck it, man. He had a story to tell. And it's not working now. But those 2 limited series, the 12 issues, are incredible. They stick the landing.
Yeah, I've read those. Wild. I haven't read any of the other Hickman. I mean, from Hickman, for me, from Fantastic Four through his Avengers run, I was really into anything and everything. I was reading a lot of his creator-owned stuff as well. My only knock on Hickman is that his stuff is so dense. Sometimes you'll read it and be like, I don't remember anything that I just read. Like, you got to go back and reread in order to process and digest.
It's tough, but I would say these 12 issues, again, you know, the X-Men is going to go back to what they were before. In this case, this has been a tough status quo for people to wrap their heads around. The X-Men can't die. The whole point of this is that they crack the resurrection. So X-Men, they essentially, before they go to a mission, they do almost like a save on your video game, and so when they get killed on the field, they get regenerated upon the last save point. So the X-Men can't die anymore, and it's a real status quo shift. And it's high concept stuff.
All righty, well, let's get back to some of the YouTube questions. At the Goji Shea writes 2 questions. Who was your biggest crush in the X-Men comics when reading them? For me, it was Psylocke, followed closely by Rogue. Number 2, who are your dream casting choices for any actor you want to see be casted for any certain character in movies going forward? I'll answer that real quickly. My first crush was Storm due to Giant Size X-Men number 1. I think it was the first time I ever saw nudity in a comic. It's disguise, but she's flying around and bringing rain to parched lands. And I got a reprint of Giant Size X-Men number 1 when I was a kid. Floored me. I think that's Dave Cockrum's finest hour. And later I really got into Madeline Pryor, who I loved the way John Romita Jr. would handle her. But when she went full Goblin Queen under the hands of Mark Silvestri, that outfit really did things for me. I was like 13 or 12 at the time. But during the Silvestri years, it was a 4-way tie between Dazzler, Psylocke, Storm, and Rogue. They all had the exact same body, basically just different color costumes. They all looked fabulous, and it was a great time to be a 12-year-old boy.
Yeah, when Jim Lee, he wanted to change the ethnicity of Psylocke. He wanted to put more Asians in the book. And so I think he made her Korean, as he is. And Jubilee was his design too, and Jubilee's Chinese American. And so they came up with a really weird way, essentially, just to, I mean, I know in retrospect, it was retcon to be a different character named Revenge altogether. They just swapped brains. but it's like she went
If it wasn't written by Claremont, I disregard it. It's not in my head canon.
and she went from being the sort of prim, flouncy purple, and I really loved her butterfly effect. That was such a wonderful graphic element.
And when she switched to the armor, I mean, Psylocke, Betsy Braddock, like so many of these characters went through so many changes.
Yeah.
This strange kind of like British like lady who suddenly is like in like medieval armor and like fucking people up, and then becoming this badass Asian ninja warrior anyway, her arc was incredible, but it took a couple of years for her to get to where she would eventually kind of be like more or less settled.
It was a lycra swimsuit, fitting with the time of the early '90s, and the fact that she had that sort of spike, that wrist knife that came
the
out.
side knife, yeah. I think it was like X-Men 5 or 6 on the Jim Lee arc where they're being rescued, and Beast says something like, "Oh, we'd also like to have back our British turned Asian like telepath assassin. You can imagine how hard they are to come by." Yes, like some line along those lines. Like, yes, you just perfectly summarized her entire biography. He's quite a special character.
Yeah. Did I answer your question? I think I did.
All right. And so casting choices for acting moving forward. More important for me than casting is the writing. And I think that's one thing that Disney gets wrong more often than not. And I hate to just be such a Debbie Downer. I absolutely have no confidence in Disney getting anything right with these characters moving forward. But as far as some potentially controversial choices are concerned, hire Warren Ellis to do an animated series, or Joss Whedon's not working. He's been totally banned from the industry. Hire him to adapt his entire Astonishing X-Men run as an animated series. Some people would kick. I'd watch it.
Yeah, my dream casting, I will never lose this. This like shot into my head as a lightning bolt. I was thinking in the middle 1990s when they first started talking about X-Men movies, and the perfect pair at the time of who I thought should have been Cyclops and Jean Grey should have been fucking Michael Biehn and Julianne Moore. They would have kicked the shit out of those two roles. If you'd cast him in like 1993 or so, where they were probably in their late 30s, bordering on 40 years old.
Or early 30s. Yeah, I mean, yeah, early 90s. Yeah, Julianne Moore was young.
Yeah, I mean, they look the part. And I just feel like, well, no matter what happens, in my head, we'll never get close to that platonic ideal. I mean, Famke Janssen was not the right actress just because she's sort of an unknown quantity. She's not acting in her native language, even though her command of English was fine. Xenia Onatopp, exactly. She's one of ours. She's from Amsterdam, I believe. She was born here, or in The Hague, I forget. Yeah, but again, I haven't seen Cyclops done correctly. That's why I feel like I know that they're going to focus on Wolverine all the time. That's going to be I get why they would, because that's essentially the standard bearer for the X-Men. But I was like, you got to get the nuts and bolts fundamental stuff correctly. If you don't got the right Storm, you don't got the right Cyclops, you don't got the right Jean Grey, then I mean, you're starting off on the wrong.
Yeah, and they tried to do the soft reboot with all the young actors playing all those characters like Nightcrawler and Storm and Jean, and for me, none of it worked, which leads me to your question, which you posted in advance. Would you pay me to consign Simon Kinberg to a black hole so he doesn't touch the X-Men again on film as a property? He's a producer on Deadpool 3, so I think there's always the capacity he can inflict more damage. But I think the worst punishment is that he's forced to live with himself that he, on not one but on two occasions, wrecked the Dark Phoenix saga with X3, as well as with his Dark Phoenix film, where he was in the director's chair as well. I think the complete and total failure of Dark Phoenix as a movie, in every way, shape, or form, commercially and creatively, he has to live with that. Everybody knows that he's a charlatan and a fraud and a shitty filmmaker. He has to live with that shame forever. So I think that's the best revenge. Simon Kinberg gets to live with the fact that he's made these horrible films.
I'm going to assume that his name on Deadpool 3 is like Michael Uslan on Batman, where it's just essentially a grandfather emeritus thing. He's a producer in name only. He probably went nowhere near the set or any kind of script doctoring at all. At this point, the guy's like X-Men Bane. You don't need to see him anywhere near there. Although let's be honest, though, he wasn't the X3 or whatever it's called, X-Men United or
Last Stand.
I mean, I think that was really murdered by
Brett Ratner.
Superman Returns. Yeah, stole Singer, and so Singer didn't get to sort of keep his momentum going. He got a big fat deal from Warner's to do Superman, and instead he took that. They were forced to, and then Brett Ratner talked himself into the job. A guy who clearly had not read a single X-Men comic and hadn't his action scenes were terribly staged. He didn't have a facility with any of the characters. It seemed like he didn't direct any of the actors really well. And that was a junk movie from end to end. But I mean, I think you have to leave that on the foot of Lawrence. What is it? It was Lawrence Schulen, and Ralph Winter. Yeah, the production partners, and those guys, they kind of screwed up some of the Spider-Man stuff too on Spider-Man 3.
And Avi Arad loves to fuck this shit up as well.
Avi Arad, yeah, he was a tough. Yeah, I'm sure you guys all know who Avi Arad is. He was the Israeli dude who owned Toy Biz, and he parlayed that into running Marvel out of bankruptcy, and essentially was able to Bigfoot his way into a lot of decisions in TV and movie for only until very recently. I think he only got canned in the last 3 or 4 years.
All right, we got a super chat here from Mackenzie Lambert, frequent contributor to Wrong Reel, and he's coming back to promote his crowdfunding campaign later this year. More on that down the road. But he writes, Kelsey Grammer's Beast is a top 5 choice. I think he's top 5 if you really love the early mid-90s animated series where that great professorial way of speaking. And I did really enjoy him in X3. But there's other aspects. I mean, once again, talking about characters who went through transformations, seeing Beast's transformation from just kind of a big guy into the blue beast. And when Nicholas Hoult was also strange casting as well. He's a hard character to nail. I did like though how Joss Whedon wrote him, but I guess my favorite era of Beast would be when he was blue, but helping the X-Men during the duel with the Imperial Guard to save the life of Jean Grey when they think they have suppressed the Phoenix power, but they have not, and due to come back out. That was kind of peak Beast for me. But one last question from the community tab from Carter Holland, who I believe I saw in the chat earlier.
Yes.
He writes, the great comic artist that is my favorite one is Andy Kubert. His contribution to the mid-90s X-Men and beyond has inspired me for years. The Wedding of Jean and Scott is a classic story, and Joe Mad's run is god-tier work. When they play baseball together in the Uncanny X-Men issue, it is fantastic. You think one day we'll get the real X-Men on the screen in the MCU, or do you think they'll woke Wolverine, dinked or snicked Carter Holland? I'm a big fan of the entire Kubert family, going back to the days of their father, Joe, who is a total fucking legend.
Stud.
I do remember that wedding issue very well. And I have to admit that when Joe Madureira was drawing during the period of Age of Apocalypse, we had a completely different lineup and a completely different setting. My love of the X-Men at that point might have been, from like 92 to 95, I was a bit of an X-Men just lunatic. My entire high school years, I was just fucking between the stand-up arcade game, which I'm going to post right now. See if y'all remember this from the days of smoking weed at putt-putt like I do.
X-Men.
And I love how that video does the split screen, because in the arcade game, it was 2 screens side by side. So you could have 4 different players all side by side, kind of an angles around it. Anyway, I put a lot of money into that alongside Street Fighter and Mortal Kombat 2 and that sort of thing. It's kind of the end of the great arcade era. But between that, the animated show, and the comics, I almost didn't need live action movies at that point to keep me entertained, because we were being so well fed as X-Men fans. But yeah, Joe Madureira, he came toward the end of that, and fuck yeah, I share Carter Holland's enthusiasm for his pencils.
I was never a Joe Mad guy. I think we've been talking on Twitter a couple of days ago about how somebody was saying Arthur Adams was it Arthur Adams? Somebody was inspired by manga art. Maybe
definitely Madureira. Yeah, you can see the influence all over it.
Yeah, and it's like Madureira, the generation. I mean, we're the same exact age. That's the thing. He's 48 years old, same as I am. But I can see that his influences, manga-wise, were more contemporary rather than classic, and so his really wild, unrestrained, thick, like Street Fighter Turbo type rendering, where the hair was almost like Sonic the Hedgehog spikes and stuff like that. It was a little off-putting. Where I had just gotten so used to Arthur Adams, almost like photoreal rendered. Barry Windsor Smith type art that had an element of humanity or dynamism, but still real.
You could see the hand of the artist.
Yeah, and there was so much. It was such a departure from that formally that it kind of lost me a little bit. I mean, and ultimately, so many of the artists who came down the pike, their first influence of the last 20 years has been primarily manga and anime, and so that more so than like cracking open a copy of Grey's Anatomy. People did not learn how to draw anatomy from text and life drawing classes. They learned how to draw it by watching anime and essentially
what they should have been doing is following in the steps of Neil Adams. And if you look at his very brief run with Roy Thomas from the late 60s, the level of detail and his knowledge of anatomy and his sense of like dramatic gestures is unrivaled. I mean, maybe you could say probably Jim Steranko was one of his close rivals from that period. There are a couple people in that late 60s Silver Age period that were really doing great work. But Neil Adams, you compare Neil Adams to anime, and you're talking about two totally different conversations. So I'm with you. Whether you're talking Barry Windsor Smith or Neil Adams, I love all that fine detail. It makes me happy. Like that issue, it's an annual of the X-Men where Mojo turns all the X-Men into kids and the New Mutants have to save them. And it's just incredible. But Arthur Adams, once again, some of his finest work.
How about that Alan Davis annual where they fought a guy named Citadel? Was that his name? And essentially they have to reach a crystal, and Wolverine takes a spear through the center of his body. The blood shoots out of Wolverine's chest and touches the crystal, so it technically means that they won because they touched the crystal. But the Alan Davis rendering on that is insane. Talk about classic artist.
Late 80s Alan Davis is really special. Well, let's start getting to some of the comments from the chat. It's going up to the top. I'm going to start working our way down with as much time as we have. But A.I. Pacino writes, just get Brad Bird for X-Men. He could do it, especially if you wanted to do a retro kind of late 60s, early 70s X-Men. Like say you wanted to do the handoff from the original 5 plus Polaris and Havoc to the point where the new X-Men come in. Because obviously that handoff in 1975, for a lot of people, that is the beginning of the Bronze Age of comics. And suddenly you got Colossus and Nightcrawler and Wolverine, et cetera. And it's just Sunfire and Thunderbird. Oh, and speaking of Thunderbird, you gave me a clip from Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends where he's voiced by the same guy who did the voice for Magneto in the Fantastic Four show. So first we're going to give you Thunderbird, and then we're going to give you Magneto, and see if you can see the similarities.
Gang, this way to Siberia!
Wait! That's not the real Nightcrawler.
How can you tell?
When he vanished, there was no smell of brimstone.
Yeah, the great John Proudstar, who lasted like 2 issues or 3 issues. Yeah. And then you had his brother who came in later on, was part of X-Force and the Hellions and all that, who was great. Now, but keep that voice in your mind. And now this is the great Master of Magnetism appearing in the Fantastic Four cartoon in the late 70s.
I am Magneto. I am the master of magnetism.
Possesses the power of magnetism.
Nobody is too busy to see Magneto. The menace of Magneto.
So that actor's name, do you remember it off the top of your head?
Oh, I forget. No, he's an animation mainstay, but I forget what his name is.
His name is John Stevenson. And if you look him up, like every show that he was a part of, he would do like 7 voices. But in the late 70s and early 80s, I mean, that voice, if you watch Saturday morning cartoons before the era of cable, you're going to hear John Stevenson's voice quite a lot. But going back to that question, I'm going on this lengthy rant just off this one comment about Brad Bird. If Brad Bird could do, I think, a period X-Men movie, I don't know if he'd be the best for like a Jonathan Hickman style X-Men movie. Moving on to Andrew 77, the 90s cartoon, still one of my favorite pieces of X-Men media content, still holds up watching it again through streaming now. Yeah, it rules. And it got better as it went. And that intro, when it starts, my favorite bit is the way Rogue does a little flip as it starts. I don't know why, but like everybody's kind of flying and soaring, but somehow, for whatever reason, Rogue doing a flip just makes my heart soar. And I feel like the voice acting for Rogue throughout that entire cartoon, pitch perfect.
The reason why I gave you that Proudstar clip was because that was the very first time I heard anything about that issue. That episode of Spider-Man and Amazing Friends was the first time I was introduced to the X-Men. And I've never forgotten the idea that when Proudstar says of Nightcrawler, he says there was not the smell of brimstone. And for some reason, and I'll lock something in my brain. I'm like, oh my God, there's this character that blinks out of existence and he emits the smell of brimstone when he leaves. And it was like a level of detail I hadn't considered before as like a 7 or 8-year-old kid. And it was just like, I wouldn't like catch up on the X-Men until much later, but it was a real like put a pin in that later, because that's a vast world I need to know more about.
Yeah, my first comic was brought to me by my dad in December of 1980, and that was 143 with Kitty Pryde on the cover with a big alien behind her, and I was immediately hooked. And yeah, my first X-Men comic was basically a Kitty Pryde solo issue, which was John Byrne's, famously his last issue, and also because John Byrne was a co-plotter on his entire run. The John Byrne era just has a different flavor in terms of the stories and whatnot. But at least I got to experience the tail end of it in real time. But here's a line from Adrian Mendoza. Disney will totally cock up the X-Men. I agree. Let's actually put that up there for everybody to see and see if everybody agrees. Disney will totally cock up the X-Men. And Lee 86 writes, Disney's X-Men would be a comedy, no doubt. Yeah, I wonder how much Disney is concerned by the fact that like they are alienating an entire generation of superhero fans, where I feel like when people look back and write the history books on the rise and fall of the superhero genre, like if Disney will ever have to kind of internalize the role they've played in alienating an entire generation of people. Because when I think about the things that I'm looking forward to in pop culture, none of it has to do with Disney. Like the other day, I realized there's 6 video games between early August and early October that I'm fired up to and excited to play. I should be looking forward to, Disney Marvel shows and Disney Marvel movies and that sort of thing, but I'm just not. But Andre Villafranca writes, it's fucking criminal. Hollywood hasn't made a proper X-Men TV series covering all of the comics. The wasted potential, it's unbelievable. Yeah, I mean, just right here. And this would keep them busy for 20 years. If these are some of my favorite story arcs and trade paperbacks, that would keep any television staff busy for a very long time. I think what it boils down to is that a lot of writers in film and television never read these comics, and they just don't realize just how good they are and just how much potential there is and just how intricate and elaborate and sophisticated this entire fictional setting was for, once again, the entire Chris Claremont run. And it is, at least for the people who were there, who were buying these comics in real time, we all know because we got to experience it, and it was just a very special time to be alive.
The guys, you can tell the ones that did read the comics. I mean, obviously, Joss Whedon owes his entire career to the Claremont run. But I bet you, like, what is it, Benioff and Weiss, who did, I bet you they read the comics. I bet you Joe Manganiello read the comics. Like, some of these guys give it away really easily. Granted, there's just not enough of them to say, they get the source material and they know the spirit of it. Even if they're not going to recapitulate every beat for beat, they understand the power of it. Instead, most of these guys are writing people who look down on comics, as most people have through the course of the medium.
Yeah, it's funny. We were there in the 80s and 90s. Like, wouldn't it be cool if Hollywood would ever come to realize just how great superheroes are? And then we got to see, the peaks and valleys and the good and the bad of Hollywood's discovery of that. And I feel like we're now in kind of late stage, kind of post golden age, and it'll be interesting to see what emerges. But my prediction for the next 10 years is a lot more video game adaptations and a lot fewer superhero adaptations. Like when you see what's going on with DC, and it's just a giant mess. But here's a line from the great Fred Schaefer from Twitter. I don't have a lot of faith in any X-Men project put out by Disney Marvel, but that said, I'm still waiting for that Rogue/Gambit standalone film. But the thing is, like, a standalone movie just is not enough. You need to be able to tease things out these stories are like almost uniquely unadaptable for a standalone movie, unless you were going to have just like great montage sequences kind of covering all this history. But it's hard to condense these storylines into single films.
Yeah. That's why I feel like you need to adopt the spirit of the Claremont run, if not the actual detail. But then again, people did such a good job of pulling out for the first run of Marvel movies, like say the first 8 or 9 movies. The elements were recontextualized. They were used as inspiration. The same way Christopher Nolan used bits and pieces of Batman, not one for one, but as elements to incorporate into a bigger story. And I feel like things like his version of Bane, I thought it was beautiful. I thought it was wonderful. I know a lot of people didn't care for it, but I think that that's a good use of Bane. And it's a good use of, like at the end when he says, why don't you use your first name, Robin, as he's checking out the thing at the very end of Dark Knight Rises. Little bits and pieces it's not necessarily slavish obedience to the source material.
Yeah, he wasn't adapting Son of the Demon or anything like that, but he was trying to grab some pieces of Talia.
Precise, exactly.
All right, well, Ray B asks, what about Henry Cavill playing Wolverine? He has that Witcher glare perfected. My advice would be just as long as Hugh Jackman is alive, no matter how old and gray he gets, just keep letting him do it. Let him get old and gross like Clint Eastwood and Gran Torino, but just keep rolling him out. And at a certain point, so many of these movies are going to start failing moving forward. I think we're in late stage superhero craze for Hollywood. And I think it's too late in the game to start planting the seeds to have like a fresh start, because when these movies started coming in the early 2000s, I was like, oh, like, wouldn't it be cool if they did this? Wouldn't it be cool if they did this? But now they've sowed the seeds with salt and ruined so many of these characters. that it's hard to see anything like Superman or whatever getting a fresh start and having people give it the benefit of the doubt. If anything, I feel like the superhero genre needs to go away for like 10 or 20 years, and then you could try to bring it back if you wish to for the people that are like toddlers right now. But I just feel like, yeah, it's had its day. And I think people now, like we saw with Oppenheimer and Barbie, people are ready for some different experiences.
Yeah, and I think one of the problems with casting new actors in these roles, Hugh Jackman was an unknown quantity, really hadn't made any movies because he came straight off of Australian musical stages in Sydney. He'd done the boy from Oz, for God's sake.
He loves musicals.
He loves musicals. That's his core competency. He's a song and dance man in the old mold. But the thing is, they don't make new actors. I mean, Hugh Jackman is a pretty man, but he has a lined face. There's a very old school.
I saw him at my gym recently. He was walking through Chelsea Piers, and I was like, oh. But he was walking through. He never stopped moving. He has like that, but he kind of like was snapping fingers at people and just like waving and giving high fives. But anyway, he was there. He must have been in town doing a musical. But anyway, I had a moment of paralyzing fear where I was starstruck seeing Hugh Jackman in the flesh.
And I think that you need to lock these guys down for a good long time to make a bunch of movies. And the problem with Jackman is that I think he can't fucking stand the diet and the exercise rigor that they ask. And like even Hemsworth doesn't want to do it anymore. It's too much of a bear. He just wants to live a life.
Sly in his 70s. Get on that human growth hormone, get a little testosterone replacement therapy, put those needles in your butt and get to the gym and get shredded.
Right.
That's my advice. All right. Well, Andre Villafranca says something very kind here. They could add some other comics to that hypothetical series like X-Force, Deadpool, etc. James, you should be in a position of power in Hollywood. The industry definitely needs new blood in command. Well, if we can get my subscriber count from 32,000 to 320,000, who knows? Maybe at some point someone will have to start saying we need to make James happy. But for now, we're just going to fight the good fight in our own little small community and bubble, and maybe eventually somebody will pay attention. But I'm noticing a recurring theme here. Shamar writes, Disney will hands down ruin the X-Men. Yeah, I'm not seeing anybody saying, fuck you guys, like Disney's going to be great. Like the X-Men's going to be great. Everybody's predicting doom and gloom. Charity Schmidt writes, after watching James Gunn's The Suicide Squad, I would like a more adult version X-Men. I mean, there is adult content in there. I mean, it was never in strict violation of like the Comic Code Authority, but there's some scenes like where Wolverine's fighting Silver Samurai drawn by Paul Smith, or when he's fighting Mariko's father at the end of the Frank Miller 4-issue limited series, where a lot of death and dismemberment is implied and a lot of sex is implied. And once, as I mentioned before, Mutant Massacre is so grim and so dark. And like what happens to Nightcrawler when he just gets absolutely fucking eviscerated because he teleports too many times and he's too exhausted for one last port and he just gets shredded. I think there is room for an more adult version, but Disney is sure as shit not the corporation to give us one.
No, it's true. And the other thing about comics, they have the specific ability to be able to portray gruesome violence in silo, behind another character. Like the art of cartooning allows you so many great ways to obscure violence where you still get the power of it. I mean, you could look at that cover when Elektra gets stabbed through the chest by Bullseye. And originally the knife was supposed to be going through both layers of clothing. And then, editorially, when they were designing that cover, I forget who the editor of Daredevil was.
Actually, the cover there is in the air, like flying at each other, kicking, but it's that giant long panel in the comic where Bullseye stabs her, but the side does not come completely through the back. Yeah. Like you see the costume pushing out. Yeah.
Right. I mean, the reality is it should have obviously lanced through all the way, but it's like they actually had to tent it as if, but it's like, I mean, did I think about that for a long time? Like critically? No, I just saw the fact that she was run through in a graphic death scene.
That's like up there with the death of Gwen Stacy. It's up there with the death of Jean Grey. It's up there with one of the great iconic moments in Marvel Comics.
Like if it wasn't for the Punisher, like there was black blood all through in those Mike Baron, Klaus Janson comics and Mike Zeck comics. It's like Punisher just unloaded, clip after clip after clip. The streets ran black with blood because they wouldn't use red blood, but I still think it got the point across, especially in the 80s where the color process of making those comics, it sort of was more forgivable, where it got sort of lost in the vagaries of making comics, as opposed to now where things are computer colored and much more photo rendered.
All right, Fred Schaefer writes, the Brood might have been an Alien ripoff, but they were damn scary back in the day. I agree, because it wasn't like they were coming out of you. you were transforming. And there's that one issue where Wolverine, I think it's a Dave Cockrum issue, where he spends the whole issue kind of fighting it and trying to keep it down. And at the very end, he's just kind of scaly and gross. But yeah, I thought the Brood were fucking terrifying. And that Paul Smith issue where the X-Men come home, the New Mutants are there, and because while they've been gone, Professor X started a new team because he thought they were all dead. So you have a giant battle between the New Mutants and the X-Men, which actually was my first exposure to the New Mutants. And then Professor X shows up, and he actually is turning into a Brood, and it was just absolutely petrifying to me. But Eric Scharf writes, Eric's one of our good pals from Twitter, we should all be fascinated and frightened over how Disney will or how Feige is allowed to attempt to tell the rich tale of X-Men lore should they dare splice it with past Avengers film history. I don't know how long Kevin Feige will have free reign, because up to Endgame, seemed like he could do no wrong, and movies on average were always grossing $1 billion or more. But enough shows now, expensive shows, have failed. Enough movies have underperformed. GOTG Volume 3 aside, who the hell knows? Like, it might be a situation where Disney stock is less than half of where it was a year ago. And they're talking about selling off ABC. There might come a point where Disney just says, fuck it, we're selling the X-Men. Who wants them? Like, because I think they might have like a fire sale just to get some free cash flow going. So I'm not completely convinced that in 10 years time, Kevin Feige is going to still be telling Marvel stories. But Bill, what you tell me, what are your predictions? Are you long or short on Kevin Feige's reign?
Kevin Feige. Well, I think Kevin Feige himself he's got some deliberating to do in terms of what his future is. I know Bellany talks about this on The Town, is that whether or not Feige should be his own studio Prexy. The idea of running this imprint is great, but he kind of did everything you can do. There's no more metric for achievement higher than what you could already achieve. Now it's curling back in on itself. However, the IP, and I hate to call the X-Men that, the IP of the X-Men, they were like, they would have given their eye teeth for this stuff back when, the Marvel, like 2008, 2009, 2010, like that would have been perfect if you would have been able to roll out X-Men movies that concurrent with Iron Man and Captain America and those things. Now they have it all under one roof. They haven't done anything with it yet. Now's not the time to sell.
That's what's incredible. They bought this shit in 2019 and they've done nothing. It's like, I would have said, press pause on every single production, and we're going all in on the X-Men, because alongside Spider-Man, Batman, Superman, in terms of like the iconic global rock stars of comics, X-Men in the 80s were as big as superhero characters get.
I thought that the prudence of not rushing the shit out the door and thrashing out another sequel to Fantastic Four directed by like Tim Story again with Jessica Alba, I thought that restraint was laudable, because they said, well, no, we're going to take our time. And it's like, ultimately, we're going to go from the Chris Evanses and the Chris Hemsworths to the X-Men is going to be the new standard bearer. And the same thing with the Fantastic Four. Like, the focus is going to change wholly from the Avengers and Robert Downey Jr. and Scarlett Johansson epoch to what the X-Men and the Fantastic Four are going to be. And I hope the fact that they've been so prudent so far, not releasing anything. I know that they have a gigantic binder, a lookbook back in Burbank where they know precisely what they want to do. And this is a good sign, I think, that they're taking their time with it. They're not rushing it to market. Because
my advice would be to go full Aussie Wolverine, and you gave me a clip in advance. Let's share that bad boy now.
Fräulein, you left before I could properly welcome you.
Welcome her? Wait, she's not joining the X-Men, is she? She's just a kid.
Wolverine, can't you see the girl is scared?
All right. For people who are part of the uninitiated, explain to everybody how Wolverine briefly went Aussie.
Okay, well, that is a dead pilot that was never released called Pride of the X-Men. Not sure it was ever aired. Essentially, it was the animation people who put together the G.I. Joe and Transformers and all that stuff that was coming out of like Clast or Sunbow stuff. My favorite cartoons, talking about the best toy commercials in the universe. So they made a prototype X-Men cartoon, which seems like a license to print money. And they somehow screwed it up. It did not get picked up, and for some reason, it was an arbitrary decision. I guess he must have come from the Alberta region of Western Australia or New South Wales. I could not tell you why they made him Australian. It's ridiculous. However, I think the animation style is great. The characters.
I fucking love it. I've seen it like 3 or 4 times. It's great.
Yeah. Yeah, the weird trivia is that Marvel, I think in 1991 or 1989, wound up making an original graphic novel based on taking cell pages and adapting it to the comic book form because they thought, oh, we have this asset, no one's ever seen it. So it's out there. They rarely republish it, but you can find Pride of the X-Men in a print form using the actual cell animation.
All right. Well, next question from Andrew77. Not a rocket science formula. Quality writers, directors, actors, producers, etc. Ideally, passionate about and respectful of the material should yield good results, but often ignored now. A recurring thing I keep hearing about a lot of these shows in the Disney era is that they are almost discouraged from reading the source material. I think the director of Secret Invasion admitted he didn't even read the Secret Invasion arc. And obviously the Secret Invasion arc in the comics is company-wide crossover, very different from what they're doing with the show. But like, let him read it if he wants to read it. Like maybe less AI opening credit sequences and more people who love the original Secret Invasion. And perhaps you wouldn't be spending I think the show cost $220 million to produce. Yeah. Maybe you'd have a show that people actually want to watch. It's the second least watched show in the history of Marvel. Like, Disney is just fucking it up left and right. And like, people laugh about how DC had Black Adam and Shazam Fury of the Gods and now Flash all flop in a row and probably Blue Beetle. Marvel's nipping on their heels in terms of disasters as well. So we shall see what we shall see.
It's amazing just how lukewarm the response. I mean, this is embarrassing.
It's like Peter Fonda at the end of Easy Rider. We blew it. That's what they're all going to say.
But I mean, you got, this is Sam Jackson's show. This was his to run. You bring in, what's her face from Game of Thrones. You bring in Kingsley Benadir, who's a great actor. Don Cheadle. This was, again, Don Cheadle's supposed to do Armor Wars in a year or two. And it's like, how could this be so warmed over? I don't understand how they just called this one so poorly, considering they have all these, and Ben Mendelsohn is one of my favorite actors. And this stuff just not, I'm not watching it, by the way, but it's just not gelling apparently.
Yeah, not at all. All right. Well, Kumo Nosu Joe writes, more films like Logan, please. Yeah, I agree. Logan fucking ruled. It was fantastic. For a brief shining moment between Days of Future Past and Deadpool and Logan, I was like, whoa, X-Men is better than Marvel. It was like they were giving me movies that were more satisfying in a lot of ways. And I remember I was kind of at war with myself at the time because I wanted to see the whole fictional setting reunited. But I think that those days are gone. I think if somebody wanted to do like an R-rated version of Elden Ring, lay it on me. Elden Ring, which will forever be known as the game that put Bill Scurry in an early grave and sent him running screaming for the hills after a few days of getting whooped up on.
It wasn't pretty, let me tell you. That's true. But we're going to look at Logan, I think, as this weird outlier, as a meter of what Mangold could do with IP and what IP could look like if being put through the Play-Doh fun factory of a real visionary director. And, we're talking about Mangold doing a Star Wars movie. We're talking about Mangold maybe doing Swamp Thing. Who the fuck knows if these things will stick the landing?
Please, God, no. Go back to original IP.
I would rather that too, but it's like, on the other hand, Logan is a one-of-a-kind, in sua generis movie. I mean, even in the comic book landscape, it's amazing that amongst the rest of these shitty Fox X-Men movies, again, there are way more failures than successes. This, looming success comes out of it. This tower-like
Apocalypse and Dark
achievement.
Phoenix. That was a bad double feature. But our good friend from Twitter, Ramsey Hassan, writes, the Archangel saga from Fall of the Mutants with the Simonsons was amazing. Yeah. I agree. I've got my Fall of the Mutants trade right here. And I'll never forget when a friend of mine, Nick Brown, called me and said, Jamie, Angel's back. And he was talking about this issue where we get Warren Worthington back as Death, who then became Archangel. But in my mind, I thought he was talking about that weird double feature of movies of like a high school girl who's a call girl by night.
They're good. Yeah,
and I was movies. Like, Angel's back. Why is he calling me to tell me this? And then he was like, and then he started talking. But anyway, he'd gotten that issue of X Factor earlier, but Luis and Walt Simonson were an incredible team. And watching, because I guess it was a couple issues earlier after the Mutant Massacre, Angel's wings had gangrened and they had to remove them. So he committed suicide, flying up into a helicopter. But Apocalypse teleported him away right before he died, turned him into Death to be one of his 4 horsemen. And Ramsey, I'm right there with you. It was fucking glorious. It was absolutely incredible.
Yeah, that's, giving love over to Chris Claremont. Louis Simonson, who, by the way, was the editor she was one of the editors during the Claremont run, and then she wrote X Factor on her own. She worked with her husband, Walt Simonson. She was originally Louise Jones, and they got married sometime in the early 80s. It became the power couple of comics. Her X Factor issues were great. She did a great job writing Mr. Sinister. In fact, that issue where Mr. Sinister gets his shit blown away by Scott finally.
It's the end of Inferno, and finally Cyclops, who's always got bottled up rage that's just wanting to come out. He's like, I'm just going to let it all out all at once. And it's like all of his feelings about Jean and Madeline and all these conflicted feelings about all these redheads in his life. He takes it all out on Mr. Sinister.
Simonson had great command of the character. Her Mr. Sinister dialogue, especially if you're writing punch for punch with Claremont, it's tough to match up. Not every single person who wrote in the line with him was able to match his level of prowess, but Simonson was such a professional. When I saw her and Walt were at New York Comic Con. I mean, they live in the area. I think they live up in Westchester. But I actually got autographs from both of them. And I told them, I said, you guys are my Judy Blume. And Louis Simons looked at me. She goes, is that a good thing? I said, it's a very good thing. That's what I read as a kid, believe me.
Absolutely. 100%. Well, more comments from Ramsey. We're seeing eyeball to eyeball. X Books have done everything. Just following Art Adams. There's entertainment industry satire with Long Shot and Asgardian Wars. Yeah, his Long Shot 6-issue limited series, so cool. Asgardian Wars. Yeah, Bill and I, for both of us, that is one of the great peaks of the entire X-Men history over the last 60 years. And then Ramsey also says the Joe Mad era was my era. Don't be ashamed, because the Joe Mad era came toward the end. I was reading X-Men from like 4 to like 19 or 20. It was right around the time of like Onslaught and Heroes Reborn. I was like, you know what? I think we're done here. And I was gone from Marvel for about 5 years, but I did like Joe Mad era quite a bit.
You see what we're talking about, though, is that it's funny. The animated series keeps coming up, and I didn't watch the animated series. It wasn't for me. I didn't like the rendering style, but the animated series did more to get people into comic books, I would say, than G.I. Joe the cartoon got people into the comic books back in the 80s, the toy commercial. The animated series essentially reinvigorated an entire generation of readers, younger readers. And Joe Madureira was their first superstar that they met. He, didn't pencil for very long. However, his profile was enormous because he was such an influential artist.
All right, here's a comment from Andre Villafranca. You should have invited Comic Book Girl 19 for the stream. Yeah, she's probably the biggest X-Men fan on the internet. I've watched a ton of her videos with the X-Men. She did all these great, they're not documentaries, but they're not animation, but she basically summarizes the history of all the major X-Men arcs and has her friends come in and do voice acting. And she basically just plays out all the big beats and just dramatizes her favorite arcs from the comics. It's incredible stuff. And I bought a few of them through Vimeo way back when. And I know she's been working on an Akira documentary recently that didn't work out with terms of crowdfunding, but she's kind of regrouping on that. But I did meet her very briefly at Comic-Con 2014. She was walking by the booth that I was working with animator Bill Plimpton. I was like, you two need to pose for a picture. So sadly, I was not in the picture because I was taking it, but I did get to meet her very briefly about 9 years ago. Comment from Bruce R. Bruce R. stopped reading X-Men after he didn't kill them with the X-Men off when they were infected. Hang on, am I reading that correctly? I'm going to put this on the screen because I have no idea. Bruce R. Maybe he's talking about himself in third person like Magneto. Bruce R. stopped reading X-Men after he didn't kill them with the X-Men off when they were infected. I don't know which infection, Brood or... Anyway,
could have been Brood.
I might be screwing that up. I apologize if I'm screwing up the delivery, but high five for the third person. But I just realized we've got an hour and 20 and ranting and raving like crazy. I still have a few more comments to get to. Bill, do I have you for a few more minutes for a few more comments?
Zang.
Fantastic. And it looks like, you and I still have plenty to get to. So we'll have to do another live stream on X-Men once Deadpool 3 resumes production, whether that's in a week or in 6 months. We are in a no man's limbo. We're in Ilyana Rasputin's limbo for the foreseeable future.
Yes,
and maybe
Blasco's limbo.
Absolutely. Fucking all the demon shit. That's what I think sometimes people overlook about the X-Men and how cool it was, how admittedly it is about a group of people that are protecting a world that hates and fears them. And that's the core. It's awesome. And then you, of course, have like that classic, like Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King philosophy of Magneto versus Professor X, two different ways of trying to create peace and harmony and equality. But they also have stuff like going off into space with the Starjammers and dealing with the Shi'ar. And they got so many different like subgenres that they're exploring, and then they're dipping in and out of all these other things. And I feel like if you just make it about like the struggle, that's the core, but it needs to have all these other things piled on. And you need the demons, you need the limbo, you need Belasco, you need how do you pronounce the name of my character for this live stream? Nastir?
Yeah, Nastir. I don't know.
All that weird demon shit has nothing to do with hatred and intolerance. It's about a demonic invasion in New York and everybody shape changing and becoming evil. And so I feel like the X-Men needs to be about more than just what its core DNA. And that's why it's so fucking rich and multi-textured and whatnot.
And that's, like when I read not so much the Stan Lee issues, but I read some Roy Thomas issues towards the end. Thomas and Neil Adams. And, Roy Thomas was really still working in the sandbox of Stan Lee. I mean, he was Stan's acolyte. He was the junior boy they brought in. He was imitating Stan Lee. He was the first of the fans they brought in to make more comics. A terrible trend, probably.
Yeah. There was also, after Roy Thomas, like a 5-year break where they had no new X-Men comics. They just were reprinting. I mean, from 70 to 75. People forget that X-Men was like box office poison in the early 70s.
It was more
until the beginning of the Bronze Age and probably the most successful relaunch in comic book history.
And so the original conception of the X-Men, the way Stan and Jack treated them, and then Werner Roth and these guys, is that they kind of were a junior league Fantastic Four. They really did not vary too widely from they didn't have their own character other than the fact that there was the word mutant used in there. They might as well have been Fantastic Four. It took a guy like Chris Claremont to unlock them, to find the potential and realize this is not like this. If we're doing our thing correctly, this is not going to play like the Fantastic Four. This is going to play like a telenovela. This is a soap opera. This involves softball games.
Along those lines, Andreas Esser writes, Chris Claremont's Uncanny X-Men is the best superhero soap opera of all time. Co-signed.
Yeah, and if it's not already obvious how big a fan we are of Christopher Claremont, I'm gonna, I intimated this on social media earlier this week, is that I would put Chris Claremont on a pedestal in terms of American artists. I think he's just as influential as what Stephen King wrote. I think he's like Mark Twain. Honestly, you're talking about how many people worked in a trench for that many years uninterrupted, and just got a chance to, within tough, corporate constructs around him, editorial interference, eventually what pushed him out.
Everybody started eating away because they saw how much money was being made and they wanted to grow it. They wanted to expand it. They wanted to dilute it, and he didn't want to, so they pushed him out.
He is, I was going to say, he's a American legend, even though he was born in England. He's a United States citizen, but he is just, I think, a creator who will never get enough credit for stamping some of the 20th century's great fiction in an unheralded run that is looked down upon because it's comics, because it's for process color, because it's drawn by artists. But it is a marvelous achievement, and we can't essentially praise him enough.
Here's a comment from Panavision. X-Men are like the rock band that constantly evolves. I agree. I remember when we were going into the Fall of the Mutants and Mark Silvestri had done a few issues, but they were reintroducing Colossus, and he's sitting there in human form, trying really hard to stay in human form because he's still recovering from the Mutant Massacre, and he's drawing all the X-Men, and he's hearing all these kids like talking about muties and mutie lovers and that sort of thing. And at one point he sees a poster on a wall of the current lineup of the X-Men, and someone's written like in graffiti across like muties or whatever. But when you look at the actual Silvestri art, they do look like a fucking rock band. The costumes, everything about that lineup. I mean, basically you got Colossus, Wolverine, Longshot, and Havoc mixed with Storm, Dazzler, Rogue, and Psylocke. And that 8-person lineup was the lineup for like a 2 or 3 year period, maybe the best that the X-Men ever was, but they did feel like a rock band that entire era.
Yeah, Mark Silvestri was, in my opinion, he was the finest of that generation of artists. He was older than the rest. He was older than Jim Lee. He was older than McFarlane, Liefeld, maybe close to Eric Larson. But he had such a command of the basics, having to work in the panel layout of the Marvel style, where essentially he would get a summary. He would make thumbnails. He would design the pages himself, and then Claremont would come in and script them after they were drawn by Silvestri. And he exhibited the ability, this discipline and control, to be able to work in a lot of 6, 7, 8, 9 panel grids. His storytelling was amazing, but he also was an incredible designer. He treated those characters, like he was making clothes for Versace. The clothes were incredible. His poses were great. He changed their grooming, their hair, and
he knew how to draw Havoc. Havoc is a weird thing where you never share the details within the black. It always needs to be ambiguous, and no matter what angle his character is standing, the circles always need to be completely kind of horizontal to like the eyeballs of the reader. It doesn't matter if he's sideways or forward, it's always the same circle. What makes him almost seem kind of otherworldly. Mark Silvestri knew how to draw Havoc properly. A look that was established with Neil Adams.
That's true. Yeah. The black costume came in a lot earlier. Yeah.
All right. Well, Panavision also writes, do we like teenage X-Men or adult X-Men? One of the things that drove me away from reading X-Men comics was when Brian Michael Bendis rebranded or relaunched the original X-Men as teenagers, but brought them forward in time. I was like, you know what? I think we're done here. I don't want to read this shit. I've already watched these characters grow up. I don't want to experience them as teenagers all over again.
Well, that was a temporary thing. I think it lasted maybe 4 years or so. And, to be fair, the bulk of the beginning of that was drawn by Stuart Immonen, who is just about in the Mount Rushmore of comic book.
Next wave.
Next wave. Yeah. His work is just insane. Because it was a stunt again, all you need to do is just sit in one place, check your watch. It's going to change. It's going to elapse. It's going to go away in a couple of minutes. And it did exactly that. But, Bendis wanted the chance to write teenagers because in his head, Bendis thinks that he writes teenagers better than anybody else. That was his particular skill, was to make Spider-Man sound like a kid when he was doing Ultimate Spider-Man. So he got a chance for a couple of, I read that, I think probably at 25 issues, and it was very rewarding. I thought it would look great. I ran out of novelty after a while, but it was temporary. But to the answer to the question, though, is that I think that what he's asking is essentially the reason why you have a New Mutants and why you have an X-Men, because you do have teenagers and adults.
You get to have your cake and eat it too. That's the best. The hybrid approach is perfect. Well, Eric Sharp is revising his earlier question. He writes, context to my earlier question, attempting to interweave X-Men stories with the past 2 decades of MCH films would be a mammoth challenge, but writing aside, should Disney Feige give it a go? I think they will try. However, if enough Marvel movies start failing or underperforming, we might not be seeing any. And so Disney is going through, we are watching one of the most fascinating, challenging periods for a giant corporation in movie history, where in 2019, Disney had 7 movies gross $1 billion worldwide. They seemed unassailable. It seemed like they're going to be the king of the mountain forever. And here we are 4 years later, and they're really struggling creatively. So we shall see. Bob Iger just extended his contract through 2026. We'll see if lightning can strike twice. If, as an investor, I will not be buying Disney stock. Where do you stand, Bill Scurry?
Oh, boy. Well, I think that the Bob Iger thing is a problem because Bob Iger is essentially, Bob Chapek, who was his predecessor, very unpopular CEO, more or less was carrying out orders written by Bob Iger, but took the blame for it when those things floundered and flopped and fell on their face. So Bob Iger was supposed to ride back into town and look like the good guy CEO, fixing the problems, because he was, essentially the best CEO since Michael Eisner and Walt and all that shit, Roy Disney back in the old days. I think they have a problem with this guy stuck there right now, and they don't have a successor planned, and they don't know who the next guy is supposed to be. And I think with Bob Chapek, the idea was that he was supposed to almost be like continuing Iger rather than doing his own thing. So it's hard to say. I think that you need new leadership at the top, but Disney is such a gigantic beast, a behemoth of a monster, that it requires the kind of visionary they just don't make in corporate America anymore in C-suites.
Well, we have a line here from the great Robert Amara. Good evening, boys and girls. Robert Amara, who sent me a DM earlier of his new film studio that he's assembling in France. If anybody lives in France and they want to work on some independent films in a setting that would be appropriate for like 6 different centuries, hunt down Robert Amara on Twitter, and he is open for business. We have a hello from the great Martin Kessler, and Martin Kessler, I reached out to him after the last live stream. He is open to coming on to a live stream here, so let's bring him in the very near future. And when it comes to video games, comics, movies, whatever, Kessler is he's armed and ready for a variety of topics. The boys in the lab. Animation may be the way forward, like Spider-Verse. Boys in the Lab, check him out on Twitter. I believe he lives in Dublin, but definitely Irish, but does movie posters. And the movie posters are just fucking stunning and wildly stylized, et cetera, and so forth. Everybody hunt down the Boys in the Lab. I think I'm almost at the bottom, and whether we're at the bottom or not, we are going to have to have a bathroom break. So let's see if there's anything really jumping out. Adrian Mendoza writes, Angel is a great flick. High five to all the people who remember Angel from the early 80s. Yeah. So, cute little brainy high school girl by day, sexy Sunset Strip kind of streetwalker by night. Age 10. I don't know why I was watching it, but I was. So anyway, Bill, any final comments from you? Any final words? Any kind of final conclusions about what's made this so special over the last 60 years? Stories that you would recommend to people? I feel like we've done a pretty good job. We've given people a good sampler of animation. The only thing I would strongly recommend people not do is play the NES game of Uncanny X-Men, which is one of the worst video games that's ever been created by human beings. But I did really enjoy the Xbox ones from the early 2000s, Legends and Legends 2, but I don't know how well they've aged. Those were almost 20 years old. But we've gotten to most of my notes, but I do think we'll have to do more of these in the future. But
yeah,
help us wrap this up.
Well, you know, I'm exhibiting a bias towards the old stuff. And granted, I wasn't even reading some of my favorite stories until I was a teenager. I discovered them in trade paperback form, which, you know, we used to have physical artifacts. We used to have books, and that essentially is an argument for a healthy backlist of actual artifacts you can get. That's the whole reason why Marvel Comics succeeded where DC didn't. In some cases, is because you could actually get a hold of trade paperbacks. Marvel had a very good program. Anyway, my bias is towards the old stuff. However, I know that I wouldn't necessarily be able to represent the new stuff as excited as I have been about the OG Byrne, Claremont, Cockrum, Silvestri types. There is, you know, the X-Men's been going on and on and on for centuries now, and there is great stuff coming out now. You know, I feel like we didn't get to talk about Brian Michael Bendis had a big run on the X-Men. We mentioned some of it, but House of M was a big limited series that was very influential. It was, I would say, if you're familiar with the Age of Apocalypse, House of M was a more discreet version of the same concept. I think pulled off better than the Age of Apocalypse was in the 1990s.
Yeah, and it had the famous No More Mutants bit by Scarlet Witch, which changed the books for a while, et cetera. Yeah, it changed the status quo. Late 90s, early 2000s, I read every single comic Brian Michael Bendis published. And then at a certain point, I turned on him, and I turned on him viciously. And I do this a lot, whether it's shows or movies or whatever. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, but hell truly hath no fury like a fanboy who falls out of love with a particular piece of pop culture. And when I turn hard, which sometimes can catch people off guard when I say things like, I fucking hate Star Wars, or I fucking hate Star Trek, or I fucking hate this, or I hate that. You're like, whoa, like, slow down. Like, but you have to be honest about where things stand. And I think Brian Michael Bendis, he collapsed in terms of his creative output at a certain point.
Yeah, and also there was a phenomenon which I think is a live stream in and of itself, is what happened to the X-Men comics during the Fox ascendancy of movies, where Ike Perlmutter, who was one of the, I think he was the president of Marvel Entertainment at the time, essentially told them, you got to de-emphasize the mutants. And so they went all in for a couple of years on trying to make the Inhumans the class of mutants. And they handicapped, the X-Men were rudderless for a long time. And that is not the fault of the
Jason
franchise.
Aaron had a good long run, like Wolverine when he was the headmaster. There were some Jason Aaron runs, especially when he was just writing Weapon X and Ron Garney was drawing it. Jason Aaron is kind of forgotten sometimes as one of the great X-Men writers.
Yeah, I mean, most of his runs were solid on just about everything. But yeah, that was a really weird thing where they were disregarding the X-Men. I mean, at no point in the X-Men's history did you really feel like they were pulling back and bringing the accelerator down and not emphasizing that as the flagship. I mean, it was almost like a choice that they were making the Avengers around that time. That became the flagship title. And that's when Civil War was like 2005, the death of Captain America, and the X-Men were being knocked back. It was very unusual. But that's, again, a phenomenon unto itself.
And speaking of the era, we forgot to play this clip earlier from the Fox era, but probably the most infamous line from the Fox era.
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else.
Anyway, you gave it to me, so I had to include it.
Yeah, well, that was because that was one of those things that Joss Whedon gave some interviews later after the movie came out. And he says, look, that line was supposed to be read completely differently. He said Halle Berry just botched it. She was supposed to say, oh, it's the same thing that happens to everything else. But she gave it this sort of weird faux Shakespeare.
Dramatic gravitas.
It doesn't work. She killed it. She killed the line. Yeah.
All right. Well, we can't thank everybody enough for tuning in. And I'm really looking forward to just bombarding the internet with comic book pages throughout the rest of the day and linking people back to this live stream. That's going to be a lot of fun. And in terms of future live streams, definitely going to get Martin Kessler on. And I'm thinking in honor of that new movie, which looks poor in my opinion, but I'm using it for the topic. I'm thinking I'm gonna have to do a live stream about vampire movies because we got the last voyage of the Demeter right around the corner. So I'll be out of town starting tomorrow through Sunday, but I'll be back Sunday night for a box office breakdown. I'll be late, but I'm gonna do it all the same because it's gonna be the second weekend hold for Barbenheimer and all that stuff. But we hope y'all have enjoyed this show. We hope we've given you some ideas, future reading, future gaming, future stuff to watch. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards. Boom, 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 boom.